Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. Today we're beginning our study of Exodus chapter 13, which is another unfamiliar chapter to most of us because it contains a lot of ritual instructions, which again don't wear relevance on their sleeves. So I want to start by talking about some bigger picture structural issues in chapter 13 that will help us get our minds wrapped around why it's here and how we can understand it. And then I will read verses 1 and 2 and talk about those verses. So these ritual instructions in Exodus 13 are responding to historical events, the death of the firstborn in Egypt, and the bread that didn't have time to rise before the Israelites left Egypt. And so what we find in the first 16 verses of this chapter is a kind of literary sandwich or chiasm, where first we have firstborn, then flatbread, then firstborn. So verses 1 and 2 deal with the firstborn, the consecration of the firstborn to Yahweh, and Yahweh is speaking. Verses 3 through 10 deal with the festival of flatbread and some rules related to that, and Moses is speaking. And then verses 11 through 16 regard the firstborn, the consecration of the firstborn again, and Moses is speaking. So it goes Yahweh, Moses, Moses, firstborn, flatbread, firstborn. Now in chapter 12, we saw a similar pattern from Passover or Pesach to flatbread back to Passover. And it was Yahweh, Yahweh, Moses. So there's another literary sandwich here that kind of mirrors what we saw in chapter 12. And although the consecration of the firstborn and the festival of flatbread are distinct, they follow the same pattern in this text. So if you read carefully chapter 13, verses 3 through 16, you're looking at Moses' instructions about flatbread and then Moses' instructions about dedicating the firstborn. You'll find that they share 6 of the same elements in order. So this is not just a random throwing together of 2 unrelated items, but they're being coordinated by the mention of certain things. So first, a mention that Yahweh has brought you to the land, or when Yahweh brings you to the land, verse 5 and verse 11. Then it says that the land was the one he swore to your ancestors, verse 5, verse 11. Then the ritual itself is described in verses 6 and 7, 12 and 13. Then they're told to teach their children in verse 8 and verses 14 and 15. Then they're supposed to have a reminder on their hands or by their eyes. That's verse 9 and verse 16a. And then the reason is given, because Yahweh brought you from Egypt, verse 10 and verse 16b. So those 6 elements are in order in both of these ritual passages, which bind them together and show that they belong together. They have this similar logic behind them, even though they're distinct. So I'm going to read you just verses 1 and 2 and then talk about that because there's a lot to talk about here. So beginning in verse 1, Yahweh spoke to Moses, "Consecrate for me every firstborn opening any womb among the sons of Israel, among humans or livestock. It belongs to me." This is a very brief instruction for consecration, and we don't come back to that again until verses 11 and following with more specification of what God means by this. The law of the firstborn is ambiguous. It's ambiguous with regard to gender. It's not clear here that the human firstborn are only males. So for sure it's male animals. We can see that later. But here the word sons, which could mean male offspring, often in Exodus refers to all Israel, the sons of Israel. And so it isn't entirely clear the gender of the firstborn who are being dedicated to God. Wilda, Gafney, and Terence, Fretheim both think daughters are included in chapter 13. Cassuto says this is just the males. Propp goes even further in his commentary, saying it's only males with no older sister. So not only would it have to have been a male, but he has to be the first one to open the womb. that is to come out and be born. And if a girl was born first, then the first son born to that family can't be considered a firstborn by his reckoning. So there's some debate about this, a debate about the gender. Another thing that's ambiguous is the nature of the consecration. What does it mean to consecrate the firstborn to Yahweh? With regard to the animals that are consecrated, it seems clear that sacrifice is intended. But sacrifice is not what God has in mind for the humans who are consecrated to him. He makes that very clear in the book of Jeremiah 3 times. This never entered my mind that you would sacrifice your children to me. So Jeremiah 7:31, 19 verse 5, and 32 verse 35 all emphasize that Yahweh is not at all interested in child sacrifice and never has been. So if they're not supposed to sacrifice their sons, firstborn sons, then what are they supposed to do? What does it mean to consecrate them? Some have suggested that instead of actually sacrificing, they're supposed to redeem them. So your son belongs to Yahweh, but you're going to give an animal in his place. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that consecration is consecration to the priesthood. And some commentators actually assume that the firstborn son of every family would have been considered a priest, the family priest. There is some support for this in the fact that in Numbers chapter 3, the Levites are taken in place of the firstborn. So instead of consecrating your own firstborn, there's a Levite who stands in as priest instead of your son. So it's possible that the consecration was intended to be to the priesthood. That also could give us some clarification on the gender of firstborn who are in view here. Because if it's, as it later develops, if it's the priesthood that is the fulfillment of this, then it would have been only the sons who qualified as priests. Another ambiguity in the passage is who eats the offerings. So if you're consecrating an animal to the Lord, is someone eating it? How does it qualify, or how is it classified among the offerings? This is not allowed to overlap with another offering. You can't just, if you're bringing a free will offering to God, you can't choose your firstborn to do that with, because that one already belongs to God. And so this seems separate from those other offerings. In Numbers 18, verses 14 through 18, we're told that the priests and their families can eat of this offering. But in Deuteronomy 15, verses 19 through 23, it seems the entire family who brings the offering to dedicate it to Yahweh is allowed to eat of it. So again, there's some ambiguity, and it seems like we have some evidence here of a ritual that God institutes as they're leaving Egypt that develops over time and becomes more specific and becomes more standardized as time goes on. So that introduces us to this chapter. Next week, we'll pick it up with verse 3 and look at the festival of flatbread and what God's specific instructions on the flatbread are. If you have a friend who would enjoy this trip through Exodus with us, be sure to share this episode with them and encourage them to subscribe. Have a great week.